know about you, but I'm afraid that if I had been one of the 12 that day to whom Jesus spoke those words that I read from the gospel text this morning, I think I would have just run the other way. And actually, to get the full impact of what Jesus said to those disciples as he began to teach them what it means to be a disciple, you have to go back to the very beginning of chapter 10, to the first verse, and read all the way through chapter 10. In the last two verses, we'll speak of some of the rewards of discipleship, and they're for next week. But today, we just hear Jesus' instructions and expectations and commands, actually, for those who choose to be a follower of Jesus. And if you've read in the book of Matthew up to this point, all the way from the beginning up to through chapter 9, at least there in that report from Matthew, being a disciple of Jesus has been a fairly easy thing to do. The 12 and the others have followed him all around the countryside, mostly watching as Jesus went about teaching and preaching and healing and loving the people. They had heard his Sermon on the Mount. They watched him still the storm. They watched him bring life to a little dead girl and cast demons from a madman. And they watched as Jesus' popularity began to grow. And not much had been asked of them to just follow him around and observe. So they thought, this is a good thing. It's going to be a good thing to be known as a disciple of this popular man. And it sure was easy to do, or so they thought. But then when we get to chapter 10 in Matthew, Jesus shifts gears. And the chosen 12 learn rather quickly that discipleship isn't for sissies. I was just talking with some folks earlier. Neither is getting old for sissies, but discipleship isn't for sissies either. In the earlier verses of this chapter, which are not read for us this morning, here's what Jesus had commanded them to do, those 12. In his name and by his authority, he said, you are to cast out unclean spirits. You're to cure every disease and sickness. You're to go to the lost sheep of Israel, and later that will change to Gentiles as well. And you are to raise the dead. Take no money, extra clothes with you. Stay in strangers' houses. And if they don't welcome you, just shake the dust off your feet and move on. Now, if that's not enough to scare them off, Jesus keeps on talking to them about what's going to lie ahead. You're going out like sheep among wolves, he said. You will be arrested, and you'll be turned over to the religious authorities who will flog you and persecute you. You will be tearing families apart. Brother against brother, parent against child, child against parent, and you will be hated by all because of my name. Now that, too, is more than enough. But then we come to today's text, where we hear Jesus reiterate those strange and difficult words he had spoken earlier to the disciples about tearing apart families, blood relatives, as well as in-laws. And then to wind it all up, Jesus concludes, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Now, I really can't imagine what it was like for those first 12 to hear those words of instructions and expectations coming at me straight from the mouth of Jesus. Would I have chosen to be one of the 12? Would I have been willing to risk limb and life to be his disciple? Would I have been willing to be hated for his name's sake? Would I have said, yes, I love you more than my mom, my dad, my son, my daughter? Would I choose this? Would I stay and follow, or would I leave? And my fear is that I would leave. And my prayer is that I would stay and followed. Those 12 stayed. All 12 of them for a while, and then 11 stayed and followed. They went on to build a church, to pass on the faith to other disciples, and then they to others, and they to others, and so on down through the ages. Disciples have stayed, and disciples have followed, and disciples have passed on the faith. And now today, we who call ourselves disciples are now the ones charged with that same mission. We are to go out into the world and cast out demons, cure the sick, proclaim the good news, and take willing risk, all for the sake of the gospel. And just think with me for a moment about what discipleship looks like in this 21st century. We live in a time when the unchurched outnumber the churched. When unbelievers outnumber believers. When whatever one believes is okay as long as you are sincere about what you believe. When looking out for number one is the primary value of the day. We live in a society where knowledge has displaced faith, where military might has displaced justice and mercy for all, where people are still belittled and judged by the color of their skin or what other criteria we want to put in there that judges them. We live in a world where demons and diseases and indifference and hatred abound. So you see, we are sent out into a world just like the world those first disciples faced. And now is it. Discipleship is not for sissies. It's hard. It's hard to be a follower of our Lord Jesus Christ. Hard to live as He would have us live. Hard to tell God's story to others in inviting ways. Hard to be the voice of love in a world of hate. Hard. Hard to be a disciple. But we have been commanded by our Lord to do so. But you know what? And here's the good news. Throughout Scripture, with every command that God gives, God also gives a promise. And a promise that never changes. God says, I will be with you. I will give you all you need and more for the journey that I set before you. I'm told it's an awesome thing to watch a mother eagle teach her young to fly. The nest, you know, is high up on a mountain ledge, and that ground is far, far below, sometimes thousands of feet, and there's no safety net. But the young must learn to fly. They can't stay in the nest forever. And so the mother eagle, when she knows her young are ready, pushes them out of the nest and into that vast, empty space. Can't you just imagine the terror of those little eaglets? Their mom has just pushed them out of the nest, and they can't fly. But they have seen her fly, and so they try to imitate her. They flap their little wings as hard as they can, but flying takes practice, and those little wings aren't very strong. Mother eagle knows this. And so as soon as she pushes them out of the nest, she spreads her wings and swoops down underneath the struggling little eagles, catches them on her back when they can't go on, and carries them back up to the nest to safety. And she does this over and over and over again to the last one, till those little eagles are strong enough to fly on their own. Isn't that a wonderful image of God? Of how it is that God calls us to discipleship and provides for us what we need? A discipleship that's hard and scary and full of paths unknown. God calls us to a discipleship that we're not sure we have the gifts to do. But God pushes us out of the nest anyhow. God calls us to proclaim the gospel. Indeed, to live the gospel of love and peace and mercy and justice for all, every day, every moment of our lives. He calls us to cure the sick in our world with our prayers and our visits and our compassion and even our touch of healing. God calls us to raise from the dead those who have no existence, no hope, by sharing with them the certain hope that is ours and theirs to the resurrection of Christ our Lord. Saturday morning, as we were walking out of the motel at the Women's Convention to go over to the Newberry College, a woman came to me. I had on my collar, and she said, "Can I just ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "Does God ever abandon you?" I said, "No, God never abandons." Gave her some information to get her some help. That's what God calls us to do. God calls us to care for those who are hurting, to set aside the values of our culture, like money and power and status and individualism and greed. God calls us to set all those aside and go out among those lost, among the forgotten, among the disenfranchised, among those who think God has forgotten, and share with them God's values of justice, mercy, and peace, and grace. Bottom line, God calls us to trust that whatever our call to discipleship is, wherever it is that we are to go, and whatever it is that we are to say or do, there God's Spirit will be with us, providing all that we need, and carrying us back up to the nest, to safety, when we just can't go home. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome to know that even as God pushes us out of the nest into the world to do these things God has commanded us to do, it's just awesome to know that God spreads God's wings and swoops down underneath us to catch us, to keep us safe, to bear us up, to make us shine like the sun, to hold us in the palm of His hand, so that we might indeed be disciples in a world that so desperately needs to know God is love.